Devotion consists in the spontaneous turning of the mind to God. This can be only when one finds happiness in thoughts of God. This happiness sometimes takes the form of ecstasy, the memory of which deepens devotion and binds the heart to the object of devotion. He that has once felt the ecstasy of devotion becomes thereafter a saint, and his mind gets steadily weaned from the sense objects which are the means of pleasure to common men. When thus one becomes sainted, one prays to God for more and more devotion, as did Prahlada. Indeed, the saints regard devotion as an end in itself. They say it is so precious that God would freely grant deliverance itself, but not devotion, except to those who are the objects of His especial grace. Devotion, therefore, is a form of emotion, a mode of feeling. It has different levels, depressions and elations. The heart of a saint, said a great saint sage, is like the river Yamuna, which flows unevenly, while that of a sage is like the river Ganges, which flows serenely and majestically. Therefore the saints as a class are poets, and the poetry that the saints of all ages have bequeathed to us is immense. And as poetry is infectious, many become devotees by the taste of such poetry, and ever after they are mad with devotion, as poets alone can be. Such poetry becomes their food and drink. Sometimes they become drunk with ecstasy by the mere chanting of God's names. Of course, not all devotion is equally efficacious. A verse ascribed to a great saint, Sri Krishna Chaitanya, tells us, "Lowlier than the humble blade of grass, more patient than the tree, never claiming honor from others, but freely giving honor to all. Such a one should take the name of God always." Being essentially a poet, the devotee has all the weakness and all the strength of that tribe. He is often guilty of extravagances, but he is also susceptible to inspiration. In this way, he tends to become wonderfully wise. For the truth is, the devotee is, in some mysterious way, much nearer the real self and much more amenable to its teaching than his less fortunate brother, the philosopher. Of course, there is in this a difference between the beginner in devotion and the advanced one. The advanced one, as a rule, outgrows the crudities and narrowness that often mar the utterances of devotees of the former kind. But it so happens that the believers cannot pick and choose between these. The result is that the religions of devotion are made up chiefly of the mistakes of the raw devotees. The fanatic usually manages to explain away the wiser intuitions of the ripe devotee, and that is how religions are distorted and tend to divide instead of uniting men. And this brings us to the chief distinction between a saint and a sage. The saint has yet some ego to lose in most cases. The sage has none. Therefore the saint has a mind and holds to a creed. The sage is mindless and creedless. The saint may become a persecutor for his religion. The sage never. It is also possible for a saint to suffer a fall from grace, which would postpone his winning of deliverance. Of course, the sage may also be a saint, and there have been and may be saints who are sage-like in their catholicity and freedom from fanatic zeal. The fact is, the devotee does not need to have a clear-cut creed. It would be good for all concerned if the devotee did not bind himself to definite beliefs. For beliefs must change from time to time as the mind becomes more refined. An elastic creed would be harmless, but such a creed cannot be devised by devotees. They must go to a sage for that. The reason is that devotion is poetic and blunders disastrously when it sets its hand to prose. The sage can be a saint, but it is hard for the saint to also be a sage. But it does happen. But this is a challenge, for in the egoless state is the potentiality of all that is good and great, and he that still retains the ego is necessarily imperfect. Devotion in some cases matures into the mystic mood of love, which is a little distinguishable from the egoless state. We can learn a good deal on this subject from the literature of Sri Ramakrishna, also from the poetry of devotion that has come down to us. The sage of Arunachala hints at the very slight difference there is between the ripe saint and the sage when he said, "That which dwells in the hearts of one and all as pure awareness is the one self." So when the heart melts in love and the cave of the heart where God shines is reached, then the eye of awareness opens and he is realized as the real self. When love is perfect, then the saint becomes a sage. Devotion must differ in its modes according to the mental level of the devotees. Two distinct grades of devotion are mentioned by the sage of Arunachala and in the ancient lore. Crude minds cannot grasp even theoretically the teaching that ultimately God is to be realized as the real self. They have devotion to God with a sense of being different from God and subject to Him. For them, God is the universal master whom they are to serve faithfully and thereby win His grace. Their idea of God being anthropomorphic, they think of God as a very superior kind of man. They try to practice all the virtues, to be good to other beings, because they think that God expects it of them as the common master of all. And naturally, this devotion is selfish. The devotee looks forward to a personal reward. The eternal continuance of his individuality he takes for granted. This kind of devotion gives a fresh lease of life to the ego. The ripe devotee somehow comes to see that this is anthropomorphism and cannot be the truth. He learns to think of God as somehow not different from himself, as only apparently different. Even this apparent difference, he knows, would melt away by the unfailing power of God's grace. And he is not in the least afraid of this, for he has ceased to be anxious to retain his individuality. He is fast approaching egolessness. Naturally, the flow of grace is in his case more abundant. For the ego is the one thing that shuts off or curtails that flow of grace. The aim of the devotee is to establish a personal relationship with God, to see God in visions and speak to and be spoken to by Him, and so on. And sometimes the devotee gets his wish and is thereby much elated, but the visions made fade away, and then he is much depressed. The sage of Arunachala tells us that the forms of God seen in these visions are purely mental, not real. Therefore, they do not last. The sage says that so long as even a trace of egoism is left, there can be no seeing of God as He really is. Seeing God as He really is no other than abiding in the egoless state, which the devotee ultimately wins through God's grace. There is therefore not the least difference in respect of the final goal between the devotee and the sadhak or seeker of the real self. The call of the real self comes to the lover of the truth in one form, and to the lover of God, the devotee, in another form. That is all the difference. But this is denied by those philosophers who want to retain their individuality forever. That they are mistaken will be seen from what the sage of Arunachala said regarding what is true surrender of the self to God. This will be quoted in a place later on. The goal that is attained by the seeker through the quest is attained by the devotee through self-surrender. This comes through the understanding which comes by the working of what is called grace, the power by which God draws the souls unto himself. The devotee realizes more and more that the soul is a mere nothing, and that God alone exists. He sees also that God alone is worth the winning, and that the whole world would be well lost for God's sake. That leads to the mood of self-surrender. Grace is, of course, a rather unphilosophical word, but it is a name for something that is real and effective. It consists in the truth that God is even now the real self. That truth fulfills itself in some mysterious way, but the devotee can give it no other name than grace. Grace, we learn, has three states. In the first stage, the ultimate truth appears as God, who is far away and unapproachable. By devotion to God, the second stage is reached, when God comes near as Guru, the sage that tells us of the real self is that Guru. And then devotion to him takes the place of devotion to God. This devotion leads up to the manifestation of the highest grace, which is the experience of the real self in the egoless state. Self-surrender is the condition of the perfect working of grace. It may be partial or complete, but in any case it tends towards egolessness and anticipates in some measure all the good that there is in egolessness. The surrenderer says that the sage need not worry about his own good and evil actions of the past. Their reactions would not work to his disadvantage, for grace would dispose of them so as to turn them to his advantage. The whole function of grace is the elimination of the sheaths, after which the real self alone will remain. Grace is not something special. It is really universal. It is the only power for good there is, and all alike participate in its goodness. But the ego interferes and discounts the work of grace. By self-surrender, this interference is made less and less, and the work of grace becomes more and more effective. In the practice of nature cure, one proceeds on the conviction that mind, life, and body are entirely amenable to divine grace, and that they work to the best ends if there be complete self-surrender. Interference by means of drugs or otherwise is condemned as more or less certain type of interference with the natural process of self-cure. The prevalence of this method of curing diseases is evidence that there is an impersonal but gracious power working from within. The sage was asked by someone what he should do to deserve grace, and the sage of Arunachala answered, "Are you asking this question without grace? Grace is in the beginning, the middle, and the end, for grace is the self. But because of ignorance of the self, it is expected to come from somewhere outside of you." What is true self-surrender is explained by the sage when he said, All that one needs to do is to surrender oneself to the source of oneself. There is no need to get confused by calling that source God and assuming that it is somewhere outside. One's source is within oneself. To that source, the surrender should be made. That is, one should seek that source, and by the very force of that search, merge into the source. The question, where is the source, can arise only if it be thought that the self is different from the source. If the ego becomes merged into its source, then there is no ego, no individual soul. That is, the seeker becomes one with the source. That being the case, where is surrendering? Who is to surrender, and to whom? And what is there to be surrendered? This loss of individuality, which even now does not really exist, is devotion, wisdom, and the true quest. The Vaishnava saint Namazavar sang the following song. Not knowing the truth of myself, I was deluded by the ideas I and mine. But when I came to know myself, I knew also that thou art both I and mine. So true devotion is to know oneself correctly, and this is consistent with the creed of the Vaishnavas. But their traditional belief is expressed as follows. The souls are the bodies of God. These must become pure and then must surrender themselves to God. Then they go to God in heaven and there enjoy Him. They contend that if the soul becomes God, there will be no enjoyment, just as one cannot taste sugar if he himself becomes sugar. Therefore, the Vaishnavas want to be separate from God and enjoy Him. But what they mean by purification is extinction of egoism. Is God inert like sugar? If the surrender be real and complete, how can there be any separateness? As the sage said, not only that, they believe that remaining separate in heaven, they are to serve God and adore Him. Is God deceived by this talk of service? Does God care for their service? Would not He, being pure consciousness, retort, "Who are you apart from me?" They say that if the individual soul be surrendered to God, the soul remains as a body of God, and the latter is the self of that soul body. The individual soul is called the little self, and God the great self. Can there be a self of the self? How many selves can there be? What really is the self? That alone is the self which remains over after the elimination of all that is not the self, that is, the body and mind, and so on. Whatever is eliminated in this process is not self. If it be said that in this process the remainder is the little self, and that God is the self of that little self, it only means that the process of elimination has not been carried out to the very end as it should be. If it be so carried out, then it will be seen that the little self is not the true self. That great self is alone the true self. The remainder in the completed process is the great self. it follows that they have not got hold of something else and not the real self. All this confusion is due to the many meanings of the word Atma, which means the self. It means the body, the senses, the vital force, the mind, the hypothetical little self, and the real great self. Thus, it is possible to describe the little self as the body of the great self. But the verse of the Gita, I am the self residing in the hearts of all, makes it clear that God is himself, the real self in all. It is not there said that God is the self of the little self. To think of yourself as something separate from the source, namely God, is itself theft. For by this you appropriate what belongs to God. If you want to remain separate even after being made pure and to enjoy God, it is wholesale theft. Does God not know all this? The sage concludes. From all this, we can understand that he that wants to retain his separateness as an individual cannot make a real self-surrender. His is a surrender with reservation, and a very big one at that. A practical hint about the true nature of self-surrender was once given by the sage to a young man who came to him in a disordered state of mind. He believed he had had a vision of God in which he was promised great things if he surrendered himself. He said he had done so, but that God failed to carry out his promise, and he demanded of the sage, saying, "Show me God, and I shall chop off his head, or let God chop off my head." The sage of Arunachala asked someone to read from a Tamil commentary on his own writings, and then made this remark: "If the surrender be real, then who is there remaining, able to question God's doing?" The young man's eyes were opened. He acknowledged that it was his own mistake, and went away pacified. Self-surrender must be without reservations and without conditions. There is no room in self-surrender for bargaining. The common notion of self-surrender, that it is a gift of oneself to God, is declared by the sage to be a mistaken one. The sage says, "The offering of oneself to God is similar to the offering to a Ganesh figure made of jaggery, of a portion of jaggery taken from the figure itself. For there is no individual self apart from God." This shows that the notion is, as shown before, an act of theft, and it is a continuing theft. What is really meant by the term self-surrender is just the cessation of this theft, by the recognition by the devotee that he himself has no separate existence. The practical outcome of self-surrender is indirectly expressed by the sage when he said, "Since God himself is bearing the whole burden of the world, the unreal soul that tries to carry the burden is just like the figurine, the sculptured at the base of a temple tower, appearing to sustain the tower on its shoulders. If one traveling by a conveyance that can carry heavy loads keeps his luggage on his own head and thus suffers pain, who is to blame for it?" Here, two similes are employed. By the first simile, we are reminded that the so-called individual soul has no consciousness of its own, and therefore does not really bear the burdens of life, which are borne by God alone. By the second simile, we are shown that he that will not surrender himself to God's grace has to suffer worries without end, while the devotee that cultivates the attitude of surrender is free from cares and therefore happy even now.